The late 1930s marked a turning point, splitting the history of the Soviet armed forces in two. Born during the Civil War, the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army gradually became more organized and combat-ready. It took Stalin and his secret police just 2 years to decapitate this army. The finish. War revealed the Red Army's weaknesses to the Germans, but it also taught Soviet strategists a few lessons. In the summer of 1940, Semyon Timoshenko, the new defense commissar, ordered officers to train personnel only in what was necessary for war. The army's rearmament began gradually. In particular, they resumed production of the 𝒂𝒔𝒊𝒂 submachine gun, abandoned in the early 1930s. And began producing Shpaghin's 𝒂𝒆 submachine guns with a drum magazine, borrowed from earlier 𝒂𝒔𝒊𝒂 models and new anti-tank rifles. Production of Maxim machine guns continued. More and more DP, 𝒂𝒔𝒊𝒂 infantry machine guns, which had proven themselves well in recent decades, rolled off the assembly line. Heavy tanks KV-1 and KV-2 were created in Joseph Kotin's design bureau. At that time, there was no anti-tank weapon capable of penetrating the armor of these 50-ton machines. In 1940, the assembly of the T-34, the best medium tank of World War II, began at the Kharkov tractor plant. Its designer was Mikhail Koshkin. By the start of the Great Patriotic War, only 1,000 T-34s had been produced. The Red Army did not manage to complete rearmament before Germany's attack. In 1940, the Red Army occupied the Baltic states as well as Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The Soviet border moved far to the west. However, the capture of new territories did not provide the USSR with significant strategic advantages. Stalin, of course, suspected Hitler's plans and knew Germany's strength, but still hoped to avoid war, at least in the near future. Fearing to provoke it, he did not allow the military command to bring the troops to combat readiness until the invasion became obvious. 13th of April 1941, Japan's Foreign Minister Matsuoka signed a neutrality pact in Moscow. Stalin believed that by reducing the threat of an attack from the east, he made a strike from the west less likely. Members of Hitler's general staff were guests at the May Day parade in 1941. They were greeted by Defense Commissar Timoshenko himself. Semyon Timoshenko and the Chief of Staff of the Red Army, Georgy Zhukov, were well aware of the existence of the Barbarossa Plan, including the day and hour of the aggression's start. But fearing Stalin's wrath, they maintained the myth that Hitler would not dare attack Russia and essentially did nothing. Early in the morning of 22nd of June 1941, the Germans crossed the Soviet border and began a rapid advance eastward. "All we need to do is kick in the front door," Hitler declared, "and the whole rotten Russian structure will collapse." In the first days, the Red Army lost thousands of tanks, the main forces of its air force, and up to 1 million soldiers who were captured. In 3 weeks, the army, in whose invincibility the Soviet people so believed, retreated to Kiev, Leningrad, Smolensk, 300 to 600 kilometers from the border. The command did not understand the situation. Directives were sent to the front for an immediate large-scale offensive to reach enemy territory. The incompetence of the strategic leadership in the early stage of the war led to colossal losses. Many units attempting to carry out orders for an offensive were encircled. Under Minsk alone, 11 divisions were destroyed. And for a long time, instead of organizing strategic defense, the military command would undertake poorly thought-out offensives that ended in disasters. Stalin was in complete disarray during the first week of the war. With a statement of the start of the war, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Vyacheslav Molotov addressed the nation on the 22nd of June. In his radio address, the war that had begun was called the Patriotic War. It entered Soviet history as the Great Patriotic War. Only 12 days later did the country hear Stalin's voice. He urged the Red Army soldiers to fight to the last drop of blood, and when forced to retreat, to leave nothing for the enemy. The first stage of the war revealed many examples of the heroic resilience of Russian soldiers. One of the most striking was the feat of the Brest fortress garrison. The Germans expected to take it on the first day, but it held out for a month. Almost all of its defenders perished. Yet such feats, which had enormous moral significance, could not yet seriously affect the strategic situation. Many thought the war was already lost by the Soviet Union. The number of Soviet prisoners of war was about 4 million. Stalin's order of 16th of August 1941 declared all prisoners traitors to the motherland. The families of captured Red Army soldiers were deprived of any state assistance, and the families of commanders were subject to deportation. However, the euphoria of the German army's initial easy successes gradually began to fade. The Russian resistance not only did not cease but increased, and with it the Wehrmacht's loss figures grew. Less than a month after the invasion, the Germans were forced to halt their advance for the first time. This happened in the main attack direction aimed at Moscow in the Smolensk area. As a result of 2 months of fighting near Smolensk, it became clear to the Hitlerite command that the Blitzkrieg would not happen. The appearance of Soviet rocket launchers, nicknamed Katyushas, on the front had significant military and psychological importance. In just 10 seconds, these machines fired 16 shells over a distance of 8 kilometers. A hunt for the Katyushas began. Segment 1. Surrounded, Captain Ivan Flerov's battery had to destroy its vehicles. Segment 2. By December, there were about 40 divisions of Guard mortars near Moscow. Segment 3. Prolonged battles near Smolensk allowed Soviet command to bring up reserves. Segment 4. The front was temporarily stabilized. Segment 5. However, retreats continued in other directions, particularly in the Baltics and towards Leningrad. Segment 6. The German advance was held back at great cost only in September, at the closest approaches to Leningrad. Segment 7. Supplying the city with food and ammunition became increasingly difficult. Segment 8. The Germans tightened the blockade ring. Segment 9. A dire situation also developed in the south, where 4 Soviet armies defending Kiev were encircled. Segment 10. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. Segment 11. The defeat at Kiev was one of the largest in the history of Russian armed forces. Segment 12. In October, Moscow's fate hung by a thread. Segment 13. 7 armies, mainly formed from militia fighters, were encircled and destroyed near Bryansk and Vyazma. Segment 14. The Germans began an offensive they considered final. Segment 15. The Red Army, fiercely resisting, left several Moscow suburbs to the still superior enemy forces. Segment 16. On 16th of October, many residents fled the capital in panic. Segment 17. Stalin, through Bulgarian envoy Stalingrad, tried to make peace with Hitler, offering Germany all. But Hitler refused. Segment 18. The front line continued to slowly approach Moscow. Segment 19. However, the Germans failed to break through. Segment 20. Fresh Siberian divisions arrived to help. Segment 21. The onset of cold weather became an ally for Moscow's defenders. Segment 22. The Germans in summer uniforms struggled with the cold. Segment 23. Their machine guns performed poorly in the frost. Segment 24. German guns proved ineffective against T-34 tanks, protected by heavy armor up to 75 mm. Segment 25, and at the same time very fast, maneuverable, and with record gun aiming speed. Segment 26. In early December 1941, the Red Army launched an offensive near Moscow over a 900-kilometer front, pushing the enemy back up to 300 kilometers. Segment 27. The capital was saved. Segment 28. The Germans were forced to retreat for the first time. Segment 29. The moral and military significance of the victory near Moscow was immense, but the Soviet command once again overestimated the offensive capabilities of the battle-weary armies. Segment 30. And the German strength was far from exhausted. Segment 31. In spring 1942, the Red Army's advance westward halted. Segment 32. Moreover, in the summer, it suffered several major defeats in the south. Segment 33. The senseless offensive on Kharkov ended in disaster. Segment 34. 3 armies perished. Segment 35. The Kerch Peninsula was abandoned. Segment 36. After a heroic 250-day defense of Sevastopol, the Germans took what could barely be called a city. Segment 37. The Red Army retreated from Rostov. Segment 38. The Germans had a path open to the Kuban, the Caucasus, and Stalingrad. Segment 39. On the 27th of July, Stalin issued the order known as "not a step back." Segment 40. Now retreat without orders, cowardice and disobedience were to be punished by execution on the spot. Segment 41. Yet despite these harsh measures, Soviet units continued to retreat in the North Caucasus and Stalingrad direction. Segment 42. At a meeting with Churchill in August 1942, Stalin spoke about Soviet soldiers. Segment 43. They're not so remarkable. Segment 44. They're not very good soldiers yet. Segment 45. But they're learning and will soon be as they should be. Segment 46. In August, the Germans swiftly occupied a vast territory in the Caucasus. Segment 47. But they underestimated the enemy and were left without reinforcements. Segment 48. Even the elite Alpine units of the Edelweiss group couldn't break through to the Caucasian oil or the Black Sea coast, through the high mountain passes where they met fierce resistance from the Red Army, blizzards and storms. Segment 49. Hopes for a tank breakthrough into Iran were abandoned, but the main blow awaited them in Stalingrad. Segment 50. By Hitler's order, Stalingrad was to fall on the 25th of August 1942. Segment 51. 2 days earlier, the Germans broke through to the Volga, north of the city. Segment 52. However, days, weeks, and months passed, and they couldn't break the resistance of two Soviet armies defending every block, every house, every pile of ruins. Segment 53, long-range artillery and Katyusha rocket launchers on the opposite bank of the Volga, played a huge role in repelling German attacks. Segment 54. Nevertheless, the situation was often critical. Segment 55. The 62nd Army was close to complete destruction. Segment 56. Yet 20 Soviet divisions held against 50 German ones. Segment 57. Thanks to this, the Soviet command managed to concentrate over 1 million soldiers in reserve and launched a major counteroffensive on the 19th November. Segment 58. It ended with the encirclement and surrender of Paulus's army. Segment 59. Although the Red Army's losses at Stalingrad, as in other battles, far exceeded the German ones, the Battle of Stalingrad marked the beginning of a turning point in the entire Second World War. Segment 60. Russian soldiers believed they could defeat the Germans. In 1943, the USSR's military industry surpassed Germany's in many respects. After Stalingrad, the Soviet press continued to build Stalin's reputation as a military genius with renewed vigor. The events of 1943 could have dispelled this myth. Eager for quick success, Stalin once again aimed to launch an ill-prepared strike, this time near Kursk. But Zhukov and other commanders who understood Hitler's plans insisted on organizing a strategic defense at the Kursk salient. Huge forces were concentrated here. Thousands of kilometers of trenches were dug, and thousands of firing points were constructed. 500,000 tons of military supplies were delivered to Kursk in 3 months. The depth of the defense reached 100 kilometers. The troops thrown by Hitler at the Kursk grouping in July 1943 suffered colossal losses, achieving almost no success. On the first day of battles alone, about 600 German tanks and 200 aircraft were destroyed. After stopping the Germans, Soviet units then delivered a crushing counterattack. After Kursk, the strategic initiative finally passed to the Red Army, which conducted major offensive operations in Ukraine, Donbass, the Caucasus, and Belarus in the following months. In October, Soviet units crossed the Dnieper, preventing the Germans from holding this strategically important natural line. For the defeat of the main forces of Group South in Ukraine, Georgy Zhukov was the first to be awarded the Order of Victory, the highest award for Soviet commanders in 1944. Throughout the war years, this order was awarded to 11 Soviet and 4 foreign commanders. In May 1944, the Red Army captured Sevastopol in just 4 days. Soon it reached the Soviet state border. In June, the long-awaited Allied landing in Normandy took place. This outstanding military operation was achieved with minimal losses. At the same time, Soviet troops began a major summer offensive. During Operation Bagration in Belarus, 100,000 Germans were encircled. The Germans admitted that the defeat of the Wehrmacht in Belarus was the heaviest loss on the Eastern Front. Army Group Center lost at least 25 divisions. On 17 July, 57,000 prisoners were paraded through the hushed streets of Moscow. The closer Soviet soldiers approached Germany, the fiercer the resistance became. With extreme persistence, the Germans held on the approaches to the capital of East Prussia, the fortress of Königsberg. Reduced to rubble, Königsberg surrendered on 9th of April. 40,000 Germans were killed, 80,000 were captured. Soviet troops lost significantly more killed than the Germans. Meanwhile, the storming of the city was not strategically necessary. In the Stalinist spirit of complete disregard for human lives, the Berlin operation, the last of the war, was conducted. The surrounded city was subjected to heavy artillery bombardment and bombing. There was no need to storm it. Exhausted of ammunition and food, the defenders would have surrendered themselves. This was obvious, yet Stalin ordered the assault. This meant the senseless death of many thousands on both sides. On the 2nd of May 1945, after 2.5 weeks of fierce fighting, Berlin fell. By 9th of May, the entire German army had capitulated. Moscow celebrated, marking Victory Day. And on the 24th of June, a grand victory parade took place on Red Square. Combined regiments of the fronts, led by marshals and generals in parade uniforms, saluted Zhukov, who was receiving the parade, and Supreme Commander Stalin, who had assumed the title of Generalissimo. At their feet, at the foot of the mausoleum, hundreds of fascist standards were thrown. But for the Russian soldier, the war was not yet over. On the 9th of August, in agreement with the Allies, the USSR declared war on Japan. Over 1.5 million Soviet soldiers, 30,000 guns, 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and as many combat aircraft participated. In this short, less than a month war, the Red Army lost 8,000 killed and 22,000 wounded. The Japanese lost 80,000 killed. 600,000 soldiers of the Kwantung Army were captured. These were the last victims of the Second World War, which lasted 6 years and claimed over 50 million lives. Immediately after this end of hostilities in Europe, huge masses of soldiers began returning home. A sad fate awaited those who had been in German captivity. From the fascist camps, they were directly sent to Stalin's camps. The war would not end for a long time for Soviet sappers, defusing millions of mines, bombs, and shells. By July 1945, about 4 million servicemen had been demobilized. In just 3 post-war years, the size of the Red Army decreased from 11.5 to 3 million people. At the same time, career officers with higher education were almost not dismissed. Despite the reduction in numbers, the Red Army remained the strongest army in the world. Western leaders sought to limit the danger of strengthening the Stalinist regime. In April 1945, Harry Truman, becoming president of the USA, stopped all Lend-Lease supplies to the USSR, clearly indicating that military cooperation had come to an end. In March 1946, Winston Churchill delivers a speech in Fulton, openly against Soviet communist totalitarianism. The Cold War era began. Stalin wanted an atomic bomb and means to deliver it over long distances. The Soviet atomic bomb was tested in August 1949. Two years earlier, work on the first Soviet R-1 missile, copied from the German V-2, was completed. In 1950, the R-2 missile appeared with a flight height of 450 kilometers, followed by larger ballistic missiles capable of flying over 1,000 kilometers. Yet overall, in the early post-war years, the rearmament of the army mainly focused on improving war-proven weapons, rather than equipping with something fundamentally new. Surplus weapons from the war are transferred to communist bloc armies, primarily the Chinese. The USSR and China actively aided North Korea in the 1950–1953 war. The Korean army received weapons and military advisor help from the USSR. Five Soviet divisions ready for Korea stayed home, but Russian pilots fought in Korean skies. It was then that Russians and Americans first clashed in battle as adversaries. The 1950s brought radical changes to the Soviet armed forces. In the USSR, as globally, this decade was marked by rapid scientific and technological development. The world's first nuclear power plant was commissioned. The first nuclear-powered ship was built. The first artificial Earth satellite was launched into orbit. The first spacecraft with animals on board was launched. In 1961, the first manned spacecraft was launched from Baikonur. These achievements, of course, also had military strategic significance. The Soviet military doctrine changes. It assumes the West is preparing for a new world war, likely missile nuclear, though conventional means weren't ruled out. Thus, the main focus of technical re-equipment becomes the saturation of the Soviet army with missile nuclear weapons. By the mid-1950s, it had nuclear munitions from several kilotons to 100 megatons, including hydrogen bombs. In August 1957, the USSR launched an intercontinental multi-stage ballistic missile with a nuclear charge. These liquid fuel rockets, with over 20 million horsepower, reached speeds of 28,000 kilometers and could reach any point on the globe. They were first shown to the world at the parade on the 7th of November 1957 in Moscow. The rapid development of rocket technology led to the creation of the fifth branch of the Soviet armed forces, the Strategic Missile Forces. This decision was made by the Council of Ministers in December 1959. Air defense, an independent branch of the armed forces post-war, received powerful surface-to-air missiles by the late 1950s. On the 1st May 1960, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane piloted by Gary Powers was shot down by an S-75 missile. In 1961, at the 22nd Congress of the CPSU, Nikita Khrushchev announced that the rearmament of the Soviet Army began with missile nuclear technology was fully completed. By this time, anti-aircraft guided missiles and fundamentally new complexes of guided anti-tank missiles, including those mounted on combat vehicles, appeared in the troops. The combat capabilities of tanks increased. They are equipped with anti-nuclear protection systems, night vision devices, and mechanisms allowing them to overcome water obstacles on the bottom. The most numerous were the medium tanks T-54 and T-55 with 100mm guns and 12.7mm caliber machine guns. Their armor thickness is over 10 cm. The combat potential of artillery increases. New BM-21 Grad rocket launchers appeared, significantly surpassing the famous Katyushas in firepower. 40 Grad. Rockets have a flight range of over 20 km. A system of small arms designed for the standard 7.62mm cartridge is introduced. It included automatic rifles and machine guns with high fire density. Developed by Mikhail Kalashnikov. The world-famous Kalashnikov rifles AK-47 and AKM are still used everywhere today. In the early 1960s, new handheld and mounted grenade launchers appeared. Rifle units turned into motorized rifle units, with more tanks in one division than in a mechanized corps of the World War era. Special attention is paid to improving the training of airborne units, the most mobile strike force in the ground forces. Since 1949, the number of armed forces of the USSR began to increase, and by 1955 it reached almost 6 million people. In this year, a military treaty was concluded in Warsaw between socialist countries, the Warsaw Pact. Soviet Marshal Ivan Konev was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United Armed Forces. According to the treaty, Soviet troops remained in East Germany, Poland, and Hungary. Although Soviet military and politicians constantly emphasized that their military doctrine was purely defensive, the Soviet army repeatedly participated in combat operations and armed conflicts in various countries. In October 1956, Soviet troops stationed in Hungary were sent to suppress the anti-communist uprising. A split in the Hungarian leadership led to a sharp increase in anti-Soviet sentiments. Armed groups appeared in Budapest. Communists were persecuted. Monuments to Soviet soldiers were destroyed. By this time, Hungarians began to perceive them not as liberators, but as occupiers. The chaos intensified with the disbandment of the army and police. The government announced Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. Soviet troops conduct a real combat operation, overcoming fierce armed resistance from the Hungarians. As a result, a government loyal to the Soviet Union, led by János Kádár, was installed. In 1958, economic difficulties forced the USSR to reduce the Warsaw Pact's combined forces by 2.5 million people. The Soviet military base in Finland was dismantled, Porkala. A large amount of outdated weaponry is destroyed. This demonstration of peaceful intentions did not prevent Khrushchev from twice in the early 60s bringing the world to the brink of global catastrophe. In 1961, a near clash between Soviet and American troops in Berlin almost occurred. This happened after the GDR government introduced strict border controls between the eastern and western zones. In October, American and Soviet tanks stood on either side of the border, just 200 meters apart. Fortunately, it did not go beyond mutual intimidation. A more serious conflict was triggered by the USSR's decision to place medium-range missiles and bombers in Cuba, where there was already a significant amount of Soviet military equipment. In response to the United States' decisive protest, Khrushchev put the armed forces on high alert. War could have broken out at any moment. But once again, it was resolved without military involvement. Faced with Kennedy's firm stance, Khrushchev removed the missiles and planes from Cuba, and the Cuban Missile Crisis dissipated. Subsequently, both sides attempted to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, while simultaneously continuing to build up their military potential. The USSR did everything to achieve military strategic parity with NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries. Although there was no real threat of an attack from the West, in terms of tanks, the USSR significantly outpaced its potential adversary. In October 1967, a new law on universal military service was adopted in the USSR, significantly different from the 1939 law. Conscription now applied to soldiers from the age of 18. Career officers began serving 5 years longer than before. The term of service for soldiers was reduced by a year. At the same time, an attempt was made to introduce a system of initial military training in schools. It turned into a sinecure for retired mid-level officers and did not justify itself. The most numerous branch of the ground forces remained the motor rifle troops, equipped with automatic weapons, a large amount of armored vehicles, and artillery. The basis of the firepower of the ground forces became missile weapons capable of striking targets at distances from several dozen to hundreds of kilometers. The mass and dimensions of missile technology decrease. Maneuverability and strike accuracy increase. The T-62 medium tanks differed from previous models not only in greater survivability and mobility, but also in higher firing accuracy. Even more powerful was the 40-ton T-72, armed with a 125mm caliber gun. Various types of equipment adapted for airborne deployment are increasingly used by airborne troops. In the 70s exercises, landings of tens of thousands of people became commonplace. But the country's might is still determined by the strategic missile forces, including intercontinental ballistic missiles and medium-range ground-based missiles, nuclear submarines, and long-range aviation. By the late 60s, the USSR had at least 600 strategic carriers. Within the framework of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union continues to dictate strategy and tactics. The combined armed forces ensure that the countries of the Commonwealth do not deviate from the socialist choice. In 1968, troops from 5 countries entered Czechoslovakia, which, like Hungary, attempted to break free from the friendly embrace of the senior partner. The scenario of the Prague Spring events differed from the Budapest ones in details, but not in essence. Naturally, it was impossible to oppose any serious arguments to Soviet tanks. The main actor this time was Brezhnev. The result was the same as in Hungary, the establishment of a pro-Soviet regime for the next 2 decades. Starting from 1965, the USSR supplied military equipment and specialists to North Vietnam for several years. Officers of the Vietnam People's Army were trained in the USSR. With the help of the Soviet Union, the DRV created its own air force and air defense, armed with the most modern missiles and aircraft. As a result, American aviation losses over Vietnam exceeded its losses in World War II. In the 70s, the principle of action-counteraction became popular among Soviet military strategists, according to which the creation of a particular weapon system is a forced response to its appearance in a potential adversary. A new round of the nuclear arms race began. By the early 80s, according to official Soviet data, the USSR surpassed the USA in the total number of nuclear charge carriers, especially missiles, but lagged in the number of the charges themselves. According to US data, the number of warheads was approximately equal at 7,500 each. The military statistics of the Brezhnev era abound with numerous figures, proving remarkable successes in building the armed forces. Grand-scale exercises and maneuvers are conducted. About 100,000 soldiers and sailors participated in the largest exercises of the 80s, West 81, held in Belarus and the Baltic Sea. The percentage of servicemen with higher education is steadily increasing, which was supposed to indicate the qualitative improvement of the Soviet army. But behind the impressive quantitative indicators, serious negative processes were hidden. The army became less disciplined and manageable. Crime and mortality increased within it. Incidents of complex equipment accidents became more frequent. At the same time, the number